Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking the incredibly intense geopolitical squeeze happening right now in Cuba. We're going to break down 67 years of conflict into a clear, focused look at today's unprecedented crisis. Just 90 miles separate the US and Cuba, and through revolutions, standoffs, and decades of tension, neither side has ever really given an inch. But right now, the dynamics are shifting dramatically. We're going to dive deep into the source material to figure out exactly how historical policies, aggressive new economic pressures, and massive internal struggles are colliding to create a literal pressure cooker on the island. Right off the bat, I want to start with this quote from our sources because it perfectly frames the extreme pressure the island is facing right now. For decades, the Cuban regime has always found some way to adapt and survive under the weight of the US embargo. But as we analyze the latest data, this specific moment feels completely different. The island is truly on the brink of collapse, and former President Donald Trump's stated strategies are very deliberately designed to push the regime way past its breaking point. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. We're going to trace the historic economic squeeze, look at the brutal reality of daily life, figure out who actually holds the power, compare some vastly different views on intervention, and finally talk about the massive risk of chaos. Let's get right into it. Starting with Part 1, the historic economic squeeze, and a quick look at the history of sanctions. To really grasp how bad things are today, we have to look at the historical lifelines that kept the Cuban regime afloat for all these decades. The US imposed its embargo way back in 1962, basically aiming to cut off Cuba's exports like sugar and stop imports like oil. But the regime adapted, right? They turned to the Soviet Union, swapping goods for subsidized oil and military training. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba's economy went into an absolute tailspin, so the regime pivoted again. This time, they traded their highly trained soldiers and doctors to Venezuela for oil, and even hosted Russian and Chinese spies in exchange for backing. Those lifelines worked for a long time. But today, we're looking at a completely different reality, a deliberate, complete cutoff strategy. And that historical context brings us directly to Trump's current, very systematic approach to dismantling those exact economic lifelines, literally one by one. Our sources outline a pretty aggressive multi-step approach. First, there's heavy pressure on international allies to stop paying the Cuban regime for its doctors. Second, there's a huge geopolitical push aimed at Venezuela, specifically trying to topple its leadership and demanding that any replacements immediately stop sending oil to Cuba. And third, there's the aggressive threat of tariffs against any other remaining countries that even try to supply the island. The goal isn't just to isolate Cuba from the US anymore, it's to cut them off from absolutely everything. Which brings us to Part 2. What surviving this squeeze actually looks like for the people living through it. When we zoom in from those massive geopolitical maneuvers, the human impact is just profound. This number is absolutely staggering, 18%. That represents the 2 million Cubans who fled the island between the years 2020 and 2025 alone. Think about that for a second. That is nearly 1/5 of the entire population, literally packing up and leaving their home in just half a decade. When the pandemic hit, it overwhelmed their hospitals and utterly wiped out the tourism industry, which was honestly one of the only ways regular money entered the local economy. The sheer desperation of the situation forced an exodus of truly historic proportions. For the folks who stayed behind, daily reality means struggling with a completely collapsed infrastructure. The sources are reporting that fuel shortages are absolutely crippling the power grid, causing consistent rolling blackouts across the whole island. Without power, daily life just grinds to a halt. And at the same time, the price of basic food has skyrocketed. To put the severity of this fuel crisis into perspective, reporters on the ground noted that when a rare shipment of Russian oil finally did arrive at the port, it only had enough fuel to keep the country running for about 10 days. They're basically a society living week to week, completely at the mercy of sparse external deliveries. Let's put a human face on this economic mismanagement for a moment. Imagine spending years training to be a medical nurse, only to find yourself forced to work under the table as a private mechanic. Why? Because the Cuban regime places incredibly strict wage caps on certain professions, nursing included. In an economy that's just getting battered by inflation, skyrocketing food costs, and a total lack of basic goods, those state-mandated wages simply are not enough to survive. People are literally forced into the shadow economy just to feed themselves. So with things this dire, you might be wondering how the government hasn't completely collapsed. That brings us to Section 3. Who actually holds the power? To understand the regime's survival, you have to look at an entity called GAISA. This is the Cuban military's massive state conglomerate. It runs practically everything of value on the island: hotels, financial companies, you name it. And it faces basically zero domestic competition. According to analyzed documents, Gaisa pulls in billions of dollars a year and stashes a huge chunk of that wealth in foreign banks. This unchecked flow of cash is a game changer. It ensures the military stays incredibly well rewarded, well funded, and deeply loyal to the top tier of the regime. It totally insulates them from the crushing poverty the general population is experiencing.
And that leads us to the guys at the very top. As experts point out, the current president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, is largely viewed as just a figurehead. The true power? That remains with 94-year-old Raúl Castro, Fidel Castro's brother. Even though he's technically retired, Raúl is still Cuba's most powerful figure because he ultimately commands the loyalty of that entire military structure and the massive wealth of Gaisa. So, replacing Díaz-Canel, which some negotiations might float as an idea, wouldn't necessarily change the fundamental power dynamic of the country at all.
Now, this detail is absolutely critical when it comes to the U.S. embargo. Back in the 1990s, due to pressure from Cuban-American voters, U.S. law was written to explicitly state that Congress has the exclusive power to lift the embargo. The president can't just do it alone. Furthermore, the law dictates that the embargo can only be lifted if Cuba establishes a transition government that does not include Raúl Castro. So any diplomatic deal that leaves Castro wielding the true power behind the scenes means the economic embargo legally cannot be lifted by the U.S. Period.
This deep disconnect leads us into Part 4, the heavily contrasting views on what should happen next.
With the regime desperately maneuvering to survive and the civilian population suffering so deeply, you've got two completely different survival mentalities on the island right now. On one side is the government. They're offering what experts call minor concessions, stuff like opening up to investments from Cubans living abroad and reportedly releasing over 2,000 political prisoners. Their goal is just to negotiate an end to the oil blockade so they can maintain their grip on power. But on the flip side, you have the everyday civilians. Ordinary Cubans are desperate for a way out of this nightmare and want broad, systemic change. However, and this is key, our sources note that many civilians are highly wary of a direct U.S. military intervention. They're afraid it might not actually bring the peace and stability they so desperately need.
And that fear from the civilians leads perfectly into our final section, the very real risk of total chaos.
Donald Trump has been pretty open about his willingness to consider direct intervention if this economic squeeze doesn't do the trick. He's publicly stated he believes he'll have the honor of taking Cuba, calling it a failing country that is going to be next, and even referring to it as a friendly takeover. Now, while experts suggest an immediate attack is pretty unlikely, given that the U.S. is currently occupied with other global conflicts, the threat of military intervention or a forced regime change is being swung like a very real, very heavy club in this geopolitical standoff.
But here is the massive flashing red warning sign experts are pointing out. If a U.S. intervention or this crushing economic pressure actually succeeds in completely dismantling the current regime, there is a very dangerous vacuum waiting on the other side. Right now, there is absolutely no organized Cuban opposition, either inside or outside the country, that is fully ready to step up and govern. Think about what that means. Toppling the entire power structure without a viable, legitimate replacement ready to go could easily plunge an already battered island into an even deeper, far more chaotic crisis. So I want to leave you with this final thought to wrap up our explainer today. We're watching a historic geopolitical squeeze unfold in real time, literally trapping millions of people between a failing state and immense external pressure. If the regime is finally broken, whether by force or by economic starvation, but absolutely nothing stable is built to take its place, what is the true fate of the Cuban people? It is a highly complex, high-stakes question without an easy answer, but understanding the real mechanisms of this squeeze is the first step. Thanks so much for joining me for this break.